Welcome, everyone, to the third installment of Women's March Global's mini course on the law and sexual violence in partnership with Equality Now. I'm Katie Simpson. I'm the head of operations here at Women's March Global. Uma Mishra Newberry, our interim executive director, is at a panel on water rights in DC today, so she couldn't be here. Please remember to register for the mini course at womensmarchglobal.org/register. If you do that, you'll get a reminder for our fourth and final installment of this mini course next week. And you'll also be able to receive a summary of everything that we've covered in the mini course entirely once we wrap up. So last week, we covered sexual violence laws, explicitly rape consent laws in the MENA region, the Middle East and North Africa region. This week, we are going to move to the Americas with Shelby Quast, who is the Americas Director of Equality Now, and she led their policy advocacy efforts for the last 10 years. Make sure that you leave any questions you have for Shelby in the comments. We'll also stick the registration link in the comments while we are chatting. Okay, so let's get started. Thank you, Shelby, for being here, and I'll turn it over to you.
Great. So just to let you know that Equality Now is a human rights organization that works on behalf of women and girls, and we do it through legal advocacy. So many of us are lawyers, and we use the law to promote and protect the rights of women and girls. In the Americas, an example that will show how we work is Bolivia. And Bolivia has one of the highest rates of sexual violence against women and girls in South America, but it also has one of the lowest reporting rates. You'll see on the screen that in 2015, there were over 569 cases reported of sexual violence against minors. 94% of them were against girls and adolescent girls. And why that number may not seem so high, you have to keep in mind the very, very low reporting rate that happens across the region and specifically in Bolivia. And much of that is because access to justice is so difficult in the Bolivian system. The state has claimed that they have laws that are in place that prevent sexual violence from being committed, that crimes are investigated, they're taken forward, that perpetrators are regularly treated with impunity. And that's the problem, is that it isn't working. It's not working for girls. And one of the cases that exemplifies that is the case of Brisa Liliana de Angulo. And her case took place 17 years ago. And that's when she was living at home. Her older cousin had moved in with the family, and he began secretly sexually assaulting her and eventually raping her on a regular basis for 15 years. After she first reported that case, that abuse, her case is still happening in the court. So we're trying to see how can we take her case to the regional body, the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, and set a precedent that will protect girls and children from abuse in Bolivia. 1 in 3 girls there is sexually abused. So again, we want to see how can we take that case forward that represents thousands and thousands of girls across Bolivia and try to make a change and hold Bolivia accountable.
Yeah, I just had a question. Your statistic about 569 reported cases of sexual violence, do we know sort of how that number lines up to the population of Bolivia? You're saying it's massively underreported, yeah. Or, the number of women and girls who live in Bolivia. Do we have any sort of sense of how massively this affects the population?
So we know 1 in 3 are sexually assaulted in Bolivia. So that's a very big part of the population, and 569 is a very small number of what's actually happening. So that, I think, exemplifies that we know that this is happening. And a lot of the reason is that access to justice is so difficult. The child or girl may not even recognize that this was a crime until they're older. And the statute of limitations in Bolivia said 3 years after you turn 18, you can no longer bring a claim. And that's incredibly problematic, especially when it's happening in the home by somebody that's known to the victim. And you may not, as I said, know that it is a crime until you're at least of 18 and you're outside of that particular situation. So that's one of the issues that we know that's incredibly problematic.
Right.
Again,
and 3 years, 3 years is such a short time as well, because say you leave the home even directly at 18, which often a lot of women and girls do not do that. 3 years is a very short time to do all of that process, recognize what happened, and then come to terms with it in a way where you feel ready or to report to the police or to an authority.
And the other piece of that, and as part of Brisa's case, is the way that they define rape in Bolivia can be problematic. We're asking them to say define rape based on the lack of consent, including all forms of non-consensual penetration. And right now, the law requires that survivors prove intimidation, physical violence, or psychological violence, and that they have to prove that. And that's, again, that goes against all international standards. So we're asking the state, in this case, we're asking the commission to take this and move it over to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights with a set of recommendations that, one, that definition be removed, that two, they apply international and regional human rights standards on consent in the law, and that they repeal the estupro provision. And what the estupro provision is, it's not unique to Bolivia. It's actually in 41 states, including several US states. And what it does is provide a lesser penalty for raping an adolescent girl, so somebody between the ages of 14 and 18, than raping a child or a woman. For example, in this case, the law for raping an adolescent is only 3 to 6 years imprisonment, whereas raping a child or a woman is 15 to 20 years.
Wow.
And it's incredibly problematic because we know that's the population that's targeted. And the fact that the law allows this discriminatory provision to say it's a lesser penalty because they think there's seduction and deception involved is really re-victimizing a victim. And in Brisa's case, the judge actually decided they didn't, when the case was being prosecuted, it was being prosecuted under the larger rape penalty. And the judge himself, without anyone asking, decided to reduce the penalty under the estupro law.
Wow.
And the person that was found guilty of raping Brisa is still at large. So she still has not received any justice in the state of Bolivia. And that's why we have it before the Inter-American Commission. And you'll see on this slide that we have here, that's at the Organization of American States, where at one point the meetings were being held among the commissioners of the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights. And we held a thematic hearing. Brisa is in the center, and we have the different team of lawyers. And we gave a thematic hearing before the commissioners so they could have a better understanding of the situation of sexual violence in Bolivia, but specifically the impact on adolescent girls. The numbers, Brisa, for example, has a center called Cube in Cochabamba, Bolivia now. And it serves as a place for survivors of sexual violence to come. It's their first stop. When a case is reported, they bring them to the center, and there they have lawyers and psychologists and healthcare workers to try to give a very different experience than what Brisa had. The forensic exam for Brisa was incredibly, it was really a traumatic experience for her because they brought in a team of interns to view this exam. She was crying on the table. They had people looking at it, performing their own exam numerous times. And it was a way, again, of victimizing the victim, of blaming the victim, of how the system was doing that. So the other asks that we have in this case are a clear set of protocols around how do you investigate sexual violence? What's the case for when it's reported, for the police to respond to that? And are those protocols reflecting international standards? Because for the most part, across the entire region, there are no protocols on how to respond, how to treat children and adolescents differently in the legal system. How to ensure that they're accessing justice. and again, not being targeted and re-victimized and being made to face the alleged perpetrator, because there's often a tremendous power imbalance. So that's one of the ways that we're taking this forward. And I'm happy to tell you more about how that case is working, but wanted to know if there's any other questions.
Yeah, I actually have a couple of questions. So one of the things that you mentioned, that you said that Brisa's perpetrator is still at large, even though it seems that he did receive a guilty charge. So if you could just explain more how that happened, like where is the loophole that allowed someone who was charged as guilty in a case to still be at large? Maybe I'll ask all the questions and then you can address them. And then also I was interested in a little bit more about what a thematic hearing is and how do you use that tool. And then the third question was Brisa's home for victims of sexual violence, or sort of first stop. Is this one of the only ones that exists in Bolivia, or are there others?
Okay, so with regard to the perpetrator, he's originally from Colombia. And although he was living with the family in Bolivia, he went back to Colombia. And they weren't using the mechanisms that are available to try to engage with Interpol or Colombian authorities to ensure that he was apprehended. There have been reports from Brisa herself that he's traveled back to Bolivia, but again, there wasn't follow-up. So it's the case not being prioritized by the Bolivian government and by Bolivian authorities. With regard to what is a thematic hearing, so the Inter-American Commission, there are 35 member states that come, and we have commissioners that are elected and represent the entire region. And these commissioners have special focus areas, but together, they serve as commissioners for the entire region, across areas, across countries, and across thematic focus areas, whether it's sexual violence or rights of children. And a thematic hearing brings those commissioners involved and allows you to publicly explain what the issue is, what the problems are, to have expert testimony, and it's a public event. Whereas they also have working meetings, which is when there's a matter before the commission, you can have private discussions with representatives from the government, which we've also done. And we've also arranged for private meetings with the commissioners. Most recently in Bolivia, in the meetings in Sucre, we actually brought sexual survivors from Cube, Brisa's center. And yes, it's one of the only ones that exists in Bolivia, and one of the very few that exists across the region. But we brought those just amazing young women and some young men. Yeah, because it's not only women that experience sexual violence, but we brought them and we arranged a private breakfast with two of the commissioners. And these young survivors were able to share their experience and highlight the barriers that they face in trying to access justice. And the commissioners don't always have access to those most personal stories. I'm actually talking to a survivor, a young girl who's experienced this. And it was moving. The commissioners broke down in tears. The people who were telling their stories broke down in tears. It was the first time they had talked to people who could make change. And later that night, there were public meetings of the commission where civil society could come and testify. And we brought 4 of the girls who really wanted to tell their stories on a public platform to the commissioners, all 12 commissioners, but also there were other audience members present who are sharing their own stories. And the list was full. There wasn't room for these young women to testify. And when the commissioners came in the room, they made themselves aware. They were waving to the commissioners that they had met at that breakfast just earlier that day. And the commissioners called them up. When the security came and tried to remove the girls because they had gone up too close to where the commissioners were, the commissioners held on tight and demanded that at least one girl have access to tell her story publicly. And these survivors sat down, elected one girl, and they just drafted the story to represent the points that they wanted to share. And we really ensured they had that platform, but they're the ones that put the statement together. They're the ones that thought what was the most powerful thing we could do. And the one woman came up, it was her 2 minutes, and she sat down in front of a microphone facing 12 commissioners with a video camera in her face, photographers around her. And she had never said her story to really anyone outside investigators until that morning. And she just courageously marched up and started to tell her story. And when her voice cracked and the tears came, she told her story through her tears and refused to sit down. And I've never experienced anything like what I saw that day. And that was the 12 commissioners jumping to their feet, giving her a standing ovation when she demanded the rights of girls. The rest of the audience did that. And it was the one thing that they closed on was that they said they needed Brisa's case to be prioritized at the commission because it's sat there for 7 years.
Yeah.
And because Brisa's case was their case. Brisa's case was the case of every girl, sexual violence victim, survivor in Bolivia. And nothing had changed in the 17 years from what had happened to her to what was happening to these girls today. So extraordinarily powerful statement. And I will tell you, we got a call just last week on Friday from the Inter-American Commission Specialist on Human Rights saying that there was one space available for a hearing on the merits, and they wanted that to be Brisa's case. So we're looking to go to Jamaica to the next meeting of the Inter-American Commission and have a legal hearing on the merits of the case. We hope that they will then make their recommendation and we can take it to the court to actually set precedent.
Wow, that's amazing. Congratulations that's moving forward. It's such hard work and so needed for Brisa and her fellow survivors. And I think that it just, thank you for going into so much detail, because I think one of the things that's important about these webinars, it's not just raising awareness about the fact that women and girls are still sexually assaulted and experience sexual violence on a regular basis, but the real barriers that the system creates to getting justice for that, even when there are laws in place. Like, so we're talking about the ways in which the laws fall short, but even when there are laws in place, they aren't carried out properly or they're ignored. As you're saying, if this has been sitting here for 17 years, that's incredible, you know? So thank you so much for sharing that. I think you were talking about movement building and empowering survivors. Oh, not yet. Can you explain a little bit more about how your work in this region and with Bolivia sort of connects to your work globally and internationally with Equality Now?
Sure. One thing, if I can, I'd love to start on one of the pictures you see, the group photo there. Yeah. We brought together, actually, before the commission meetings, different organizations who are working to end sexual violence in Bolivia and brought them together in one place. And it resulted actually in the first coalition to address sexual violence of adolescents and girls and boys in Bolivia. And you'll see in the very front row are the girls I was talking about that actually gave their testimony. And on the right are the two commissioners on the private breakfast that I talked about. But how we link this, what we see in Bolivia is not unique to Bolivia across the region. So we're trying to take the example of Cube, the center in Cochabamba, and how can we make that something that's looked at across Bolivia? How can we help support more centers, more one-stop shops, more training of judges and lawyers, a lot of the things that are happening there? How can we help support that happening across Bolivia, but also then across the region? How can we share best practices, share protocols, get the commission, get the regional body involved in saying these laws are best practices, these protocols are best practices, and get them to work with governments to ensure that that's happening, working with global partnership to end violence against children. And then for us, what we see, because we have offices, as you mentioned, in the Middle East, North Africa, in Beirut, Lebanon, but we also have in the Africa office, Sub-Saharan Africa in Nairobi, Kenya, and West Africa, but also a presence in Eurasia and an office in Europe, that we see this as a common issue, that rape of children, especially adolescent girls. And that even when there are good laws, it's about the implementation. It's about raising awareness about the law, accountability towards the law, and commitments for the government, for duty bearers. So that means for the courts, for court personnel, for police, for social workers, for the government itself to prioritize that issue in schools, for children to be made aware of what their rights are and what's right and what's wrong, for bodily integrity. Standards on consent. So we try to draw a thread across our work in the different regions and elevate that up to the international level, working with the United Nations. Recently, in 2015, 193 countries agreed on a set of sustainable development goals to achieve by 2030, so Agenda 2030. And within that are several very specific targets and goals to address sexual violence towards women and towards children. And we're trying to ensure that, again, there are more than words on paper, that governments are being held accountable to implementing those SDGs, that donors are held accountable to funding groups who are implementing programs to make sure that they're, again, that it's more than words on paper, that this agenda actually moves things forward to end sexual violence.
I completely agree. And I want to pick up on what you said about the fact that this is happening all across the world, and it's a similar theme, right? It's not just isolated incidences in particular areas due to particular cultures, because we see it in every culture, in every country. And I think, that's also one of the things Women's March Global's goals is to show that violence against women, and in particular sexual violence against women, is a global theme, and people need to be aware of that, because I think especially to speak to accountability, when you start to isolate the incidences, it seems quote unquote less important. Oh, this one case slipped through the cracks, right? Well, it was just this one instance, but it's not. It's everywhere, and it's a consistent thing that's happening. And so we really need to garner international support, as you all are doing with the UN and with the SDGs, to make these things actionable and not just words on paper, as you said. So thank you so much. Do you have any final thoughts or things that you want to share before we wrap up?
I think just one other thought about the idea of accountability. Even at the United Nations, where they've come up with this really great set of sustainable development goals, but they're not immune either to sexual harassment within the United Nations, sexual violence within the UN, and several large international non-governmental organizations that we've seen come up recently because of sexual violence within them, inside the World Bank, inside government. So I think that issue of not just looking outside, not just looking when it happens elsewhere, that will come in and, yes, hold them, but looking internally and ensuring that all of our organizations really have zero tolerance for sexual harassment, for sexual violence, and holding ourselves accountable, because much of this has become a result of the normalization, of the acceptance. Well, it's not really that harmful. It is that harmful. And we need to stop that. The Me Too movement has been incredibly strong. I don't think the laws and accountability have caught up to it yet. So there's a lot of work for us to do. A lot of people think the law doesn't solve things, and on its own, it does not. But it has to be implemented, and it's used for us as a tool for prevention. 98% of the time, prosecution 2% of the time. But we need to ensure those rights are enshrined in the system, and that we have political will, and where we don't, we push governments to help them have political will.
Exactly. I think, you touched on it, the larger systemic issues of the patriarchy and power imbalances, and sort of the unimportance of the lives of women and girls at it, to speak very frankly or plainly about it, right? And that's where you need to build the peer pressure to say like, no, this is not okay. And we have these things in place, these laws and systems that can be enforced, and where they cannot, we need to make them stronger, strengthen them so that they can be. And you're right. I think these two things have to go hand in hand. The law can't stand on its own, but it's such a crucial piece of, I think as Equality Now puts it, it's a crucial piece where the government can say, this is what we believe in, right? And this is our ideal, and this is what we think has importance and who deserves rights. So yeah, thank you so much. I think that's a great place to end on. Again, everyone, this is Shelby Quast from Equality Now, and you're watching the Women's March Global and Equality Now mini course on sexual violence in the law. Please register at womensmarchglobal.org/register, and you will get updates so you can follow us and join us for our final session next week. We will be discussing what's next, future steps and forward movement, and on the importance of equality in the law for women and girls, particularly around sexual violence. So thank you, Shelby, and everyone have a great day.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.